Now that we've done the quality checks, I can welcome you to this workshop on digital learning. First, a quick overview of what we're going to do in this session. We're going to mention some of the history of electronic media in education and maybe point out some of the missteps that took place early on in the evolution of this medium. Then we'll discuss the components of the community of inquiry concept that's used for designing and carrying out digital learning. And at the end, I'm going to take and look in more detail at one of these components, that of social presence. So you should have already read chapters 1 through 6 in the book E-Learning in the 21st Century, written by D. Randy Garrison. And I'm going to be discussing the material in these chapters throughout this workshop. So what's e-learning? According to Garrison, as I read in the book, e-learning is formally defined as electronically mediated, asynchronous, and synchronous communication for the purpose of construction and confirming knowledge. I think an emphasis here is on the communication aspect of this, and that's somewhat of what we're going to be focusing on today. Now, some of you may have had some experience with e-learning in the past, or have talked to other people who have taken electronic mediated courses, or maybe just haven't done it, but you have some idea of what it's going to be like. So I wanted to start by having you list a few advantages and disadvantages. What are the pros and cons of e-learning before we move further? So what I'm going to ask you to do is pause the recording now and take out a piece of paper and write 2 or 3 disadvantages and 2 or 3 advantages. So pause it now, and then we'll come back in just a short time. All right, so we're back. I assume that you've written a few things down. What I'm going to do is show you the things that I've come up with. And this is not an extensive list, but is the things that I've thought were the most relevant, and I think most people would come to these to something on this list. You may have something different, and that would be great too. So here's my list of advantages. One thing is that there's nearly instant access to information with the technology that we have now, through the internet, through the variety of sources we can look up, the sites we can find information on. Then, of course, e-learning can be asynchronous in time and in place. You don't have to be there, excuse me, and you don't have to be there at the time the class is going on. So that gives you a certain amount of freedom. It actually, as we mentioned before, it establishes communication channels amongst the learners. So one of the advantages of e-learning are these communication pathways that are devoted to the interactions that expand the communication and the educational experience. And of course, it facilitates multimedia components that can be visual and text or oral. We can put up slideshows, we can put up videos, and this can be all done in real time. Graphs can be created, for instance. All right, so that's the pros. What are the cons? This is my list. There's a potential for isolated learning, and this is one of the bad side roads that e-learning took on early. It became almost a distant learning process where material was packaged up and sent out, and then people learned it on their own, and there wasn't a community developed, a community of learners. It does require some technology and some fluency with using computers and knowledge of how to make them work, and what's the typically graphic user interface. And it can, somewhat related to the first, relax the interactions between learners, so people can feel like they are out on their own. Now, some of these disadvantages may result from poorly designed e-learning experiences. E-learning technologies are not simply a different context for delivering the same material. In fact, um, this is what was done earlier on. We found that we could make videos of our lectures and simply put them on a server somewhere, and people could look at them and anytime. So this was the early use of electronic technologies for education. But it turns out that the learning outcomes, were the same when we compared conventional and electronic methods for educators to simply deliver the same information. Um, Rather, a properly designed e-learning program changes the focus from the educator, from the instructor delivering the lecture, to the learner, and uses the capabilities of electronic medium beyond that of a one-way transfer of information from the teacher to the student. Early on in this process, there was a rush to use this technology, as I mentioned, just as another means of delivering the same material. And I experienced one of these moves towards digital lectures about 10 years ago. It was decided by the powers that be for a course in which I gave lectures that all of us faculty would record our lectures in a sound studio so that the students could access them at any time. Sounded like a great idea. Students didn't have to come to lectures at 8 in the morning. They could sit on at their coffee table and enjoy our talks to them. But the result was a disaster. It turns out that narrating an ad-lib lecture on your computer while we're recording our PowerPoint slides resulted in ponderous narratives that were full of misspoken words and unclear objectives. And even when I revised my narration and used a defined script for each slide, the result was not useful. And within a year, we abandoned that whole approach. So we were just doing the same thing. We were delivering a lecture to the students on a video. We were using electronic technology. Big deal. We got the same result for a lot of extra effort. There wasn't an advance in the learning process. So the lack of physical presence, however, in an electronic learning environment does not mean that a community of learners cannot be developed. And in fact, as I mentioned before, this is where the electronic technologies can have a powerful impact on the learning experience because they provided a specific communication channel for the learners to interact. And as an example of how that can have an impact, we just look at what electronic technologies have done for our everyday social interactions with Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook, being probably Twitter, some of the front runners. So what is this community of inquiry that I've mentioned? It's as defined by Dr. Garrison, the result of educators looking closely at the learning experience and trying to dissect what goes on to define the salient components. So Dr. Garrison developed this framework of the community of inquiry, and as he puts it, it's based on the premise that a community of learners is an essential core element for the educational experience. And this premise has been confirmed by research and experience since it was put forward more than a decade ago. So what I've listed here are the three components of the community of inquiry. At this time, I'm going to ask you again to pause the recording in just a second, and this is what I want you to do this time. This time, write down a definition or a working model for each of these three components. So social presence, cognitive presence, teacher presence, things that you've already read about in Dr. Garrison's book. recall what that means. And if you have to go back to the book, that's fine. That will be just as well. So pause it now and then come back and just when you've got that done. Okay, we're back again. Let me go back. Sorry. Um, Social presence, to paraphrase Garrison, is a condition in which the participants can form a group identity and communicate in a trusting environment. So that's what I have down for this, and this is pretty much from the book. As they create this trusting environment, they will develop relationships by projecting their own personalities. Cognitive presence, cognitive presence is the ability to construct meaning from information. So in the e-learning environment as described by Garrison, this is based on a model of practical inquiry that includes exploration of a problem, reflection, and discourse. Some of the things that we're going through in this workshop. Teaching presence. This is the design and the facilitation of the e-learning experience by the educator. It's the interaction of the teacher with the learners to move the discussion and understanding towards the educational goals, as well as maintain a balance between the individual identities and the group identity. In the remainder of this workshop, what I'm going to do is explore the social presence component of the community of inquiry and somewhat relate that to my own discipline of neuroscience and how this concept of social presence and in the community plays an important role. The neuroscience is a highly interdisciplinary subject, and the subjects themselves can range from investigations at the molecular level to psychological assessments of complex human behavior. Those all are interconnected in some way, and very few people can span that entire range of disciplines. So in a neuroscience class, you may have students that have majors or are coming from biology or psychology or any of the health sciences. And this means that there must be considerable interactions between these people with different perspectives that are derived from their prior knowledge and their goal for the course. Developing and maintaining the social presence in the e-learning activities of a neuroscience course will be critical for communication between the learners. The molecular biologists have to be able to talk to the behavioral psychologist, for instance. However, in an e-learning environment, the use of text as the primary medium of communication requires some attention to the components that comprise social presence. So what is social presence? It's divided up by Garrison in 3 classifications and definitions of interactions. Essentially in the social presence, the learners will develop an ability to identify with the group that is their learning peers. They'll communicate in an open and trusting environment while still projecting their own personalities and their perspectives, and based on their previous experience and their knowledge. So there's a balance that must be struck between group members sharing socioeconomic feelings to develop the social presence and having this communication overwhelm the interactions taking place. Garrison states that, and I quote, group identity takes precedence over personal identity. So there has to be a certain balance constructed, and where that balance point falls is the role that the teaching presence, the educator, has in the community of inquiry. It's not something we're going to explore today. So I've listed these 3 classifications and indicators of social presence in this slide. Again, I'm going to ask you to stop the recording in just a minute and write down a few descriptors or examples of these. Interpersonal communication, open communication, and cohesive. How do we know when we are using one or another of these in our interactions in the learning group? So pause the recording now and come back in just a few seconds. All right, so what I have here, um, uh, interpersonal communication is composed of comments that are centered on the individual sending them. So they can be relevant to the subject material, but they are really given to expose or explain something about the sender. You might write something like, "I don't get this." You know, sender might and learner might send that out to the group. Um, or it can be just general shout outs to everybody. "Hello, how are you today?" It's not so much contributing to moving the discussion forward, but it's um, projecting their personality into the group. Open communication is composed of comments that are derived from communications of others in the group. So that this can be responses to other comments. You can reply to a post. The purpose of these are to improve the understanding of the subject material, to perhaps as a reply to define or refine what the individual said. Cohesive communication are comments that address specific individuals in the group by name, refer to the group as an entire group, and they move the group forward in the discussion of their subject that they are learning. It's the cohesion of the group that the social presence is attempting to achieve. So once you've got a good set of cohesive communications, then the group is functioning well in the social presence um, um, regime. So here's a summary again of the interpersonal communication, and you can go back on these later if you want from the recording. Open communication, I just repeated the things that I said previously here, and cohesive communication again. So I'm going to give a summary here of what we did today. We examined some of the disadvantages and advantages of e-learning and found that one of the disadvantages is the potential lack of interpersonal interactions. That is, e-learning is not meant to be distant learning with all the material packaged for individuals to learn on their own. We want to develop a community. So e-learning can be constructed to achieve a community of inquiry amongst the learners that's comprised of a social presence, cognitive presence, and teacher presence. It's a social presence component that is instrumental in the development of the community of inquiry. Directing the types of communication that takes place in the group, e-learning environment towards cohesive communication will enhance the social presence of the community of inquiry. And this will allow learners of different perspectives to participate and thereby expand the understanding of the entire group towards the subject material. And that's the end of the workshop today.